the privilege of introducing my boss, actually, the chair of the Bible department, Dr. Brian Smith, and his lovely wife is just right over here. She's also a professor here at Messiah. I don't know the guest in her lap, but welcome. Wonderful. Good to have you. Okay, that works for this session. Right on. Old Testament scholar is Dr. Brian Smith. He's also a teaching college pastor, so you've probably seen him in chapel quite a bit. And he's got a lot for us today. Why don't we give him a hand? And he'll get started.
Thank you, Charlie. One point of clarification, that's not my child.
But is it Valerie's?
Crystal. That is our what do we say? Great nephew? Great nephew or grand nephew? Valerie's niece is born, so we're delighted to take care of Eli for a little while today. This presentation, oh, by the way, first of all, let me say I'm delighted that so many of you have come out to hear talk about Hebrew language and the Old Testament. And this is really, sarcasm is never good. It's a pedagogical tool. Well, this presentation was born of the intersection of three different things. The theme of the symposium, a particular phrase in the Hebrew Bible, and my course load, which this semester happens to include Biblical Hebrew. So I thought it a great opportunity to explore a topic of interest and involve my students in a little research. And as I have given a certain amount of my life to education, I have a particular rubric for this experiment. Most important, I hope my students have discovered the fun of research and have learned a little bit of more Hebrew along the way. That's my first important. Second, I hope we can all come to a better understanding of the Hebrew Bible. And finally, I hope that we can make some small contribution to the symposium. Now, the phrase in question is, "The land had rest." And it occurs in a handful of passages in Joshua and Judges. There are other passages that contain similar or related ideas, and we will describe these for you a little later. First, a note about pedagogy and methodology. This is my first foray into involving students in a project of this sort. Previous student involvement went something like this. Please go fetch a book for me, and while you're at it, return these. Or please pull together all the references containing this particular verb, or please read this and tell me if it makes any sense. Something like that. Helpful for me, but not exactly scintillating for my students. Now, I won't pretend that my intermediate Hebrew students were scintillated by this particular project, but I at least didn't have them running to the library to return my books. Specifically, the students translated texts, they tracked down relevant passages, they consulted dictionaries, and perhaps most importantly, they helped me think about how this very little project can enrich our understanding of the Bible. So our first step was to identify each instance of the phrase in question, and any similar phrases or related passages. I assigned this task to Jennifer Isaacs, who made use of the free and generally pretty helpful Blue Letter Bible. And you know, it dawned on me just last week why it's called Blue Letter Bible. You may have heard of the Red Letter Bibles, where all the words of Jesus are in red. Some people are even called Red Letter Christians. Anybody care to guess why this is called Blue Letter Bible? It's full of links. It's on the web, and it's all full of, well, I guess that's why it's called Blue Letter. I haven't heard any other reason why it would be called the Blue Letter Bible. Well, this allowed her to search for the precise phrase in a variety of English translations, but more importantly, it allowed her immediately to pull up the Hebrew behind those texts. And she thus avoided something that we used to have to use in graduate school, which is a big concordance of the Hebrew Bible, all in Hebrew. And Jen, am I exaggerating? No, it's about that big. It weighs a hefty 10 pounds or so, and she didn't have to use it. It was great. So the class then took the various references, and then they translated them after we divided them up. And translating is great fun if you know what the thing says. But when you're
not always the case.
Right, when you're in the early weeks of intermediate Hebrew, an assignment like this can seem a little bit daunting. But as a class exercise, it was fairly typical, right? And the students were able to report back with their translation efforts. We were then able to spend some time thinking about the context of these phrases, how the phrases were used, and what the various words signified in each use. So here's the set of texts with which we began our work. our search. So this first phrase is the initial phrase that had me interested, right? And so these first occurrences are the places in which that text occurs, or that phrase occurs. So Joshua 11:23, Joshua took the whole land according to all that the Lord had spoken to Moses. Joshua gave it for an inheritance to Israel according to the tribal allotments, and the land had rest from war. So that was the phrase that caught my eye in my mind in thinking about this symposium topic and the biblical text. Similarly, in Joshua 14:15, and the land had rest from war. Judges 3:11, so the land had rest for 40 years. Judges 3:30, same, the land had rest for 80 years. Judges 5:31, very formulaic, right? And the land had rest for 40 years. The next group of them, Midian was subdued before the Israelites. They lifted their heads no more, so the land had rest for 40 years in the days of Gideon. And then, interestingly enough, in 2 Chronicles 14, we get the same phrase used. There's a parallel passage in Kings that doesn't use this particular phrase, but Chronicles does. And it's almost calling back to the texts in Joshua and in Judges. And I don't know quite why that is. I haven't given enough thought to it, but it is interesting that it pops up in Chronicles, which is a very late text, much later than the books of Joshua and Judges. So Abijah, this is within the history of the kings. Abijah slept with his ancestors. They buried him in the city of David. That's also very formulaic. His son Asa succeeded him. In his days, the land had rest for 10 years. So the same thing is used there. And then just a few verses later, he built fortified cities in Judah while the land had rest. He had no war in those years, for Yahweh gave him peace. Now here we have, cheek by jowl, this notion of rest from war and the land resting, but it's not quite the exact phrase that we are looking for in other places. But also interesting here is that, when you have rest, when there's peace in the land, you can do things like build cities and focus on development and literature and the arts, things that a society like this would not typically have had time for or resources for during periods of war. The next phrase was rest for the land, and this came up in Jen's research. Leviticus 25, in the 7th year there shall be a Sabbath of complete rest for the land, the Sabbath for Yahweh. You shall not sow your field and prune your vineyard. You shall not reap the aftergrowth of your harvest or gather the grapes of your unpruned vine. It shall be a year of complete rest for the land. Another phrase, the land will rest. Leviticus 26, the land shall enjoy its Sabbath years as long as it lies desolate. While you are in the land of your enemies, then the land will rest. Now, this is a fascinating passage, and I'm going to come back to this toward the end of our presentation today, so try to hold off your thoughts on that until later. Exodus 23, for 6 years you will sow your land and gather its yield, but in the 7th year you shall let it rest and lie fallow. Okay, more resting of the land. Now, peace in the land. I will grant peace in the land, and you will lie down. No one shall make you afraid. I will remove dangerous animals from the land, and no sword shall go through your land. So this is the first instance we've seen of the word peace, and here it's shalom, and in relationship to this resting of the land. Give rest to the land. This is a prophetic text in Jeremiah 50. Their Redeemer is strong. Yahweh of hosts is his name. He will surely plead their cause, that he may give rest to the land, but unrest to the inhabitants of Babylon. And Brandon's going to talk about that text in a few minutes. Joshua 1:13, back to the beginning. This is a little different arrangement of language, which is why I've got it later in the presentation. Remember the word that Moses, the servant of the Lord, commanded you, saying, Yahweh your God is providing you a place of rest and will give you this land. So there, the land is the means by which the people rest. So it's a slightly different arrangement of the two. But this is the kind of thing that pops up when you go looking for the occurrences of several different words close to each other. Okay, so once we had a body of texts with which to work, we can identify the specific Hebrew words and phrases behind the initial English. When you look at the English, you're not really certain of what it is they're giving you, what they're translating into the English words that you see. And you can look at a variety of different English translations, but that's still not going to give you exactly what it is, what's back there. So the related words that we had to find are the Hebrew ones. So the students then could do what we call a word study, right, where they examine the semantic range of a particular word. And this is accomplished by looking at word usage. We all know that words have root meanings. And sometimes we can go all the way back to the very beginning, if you will, of that word in a particular language and explain why something means what it means on the basis of what it originally represented or the idea it was originally trying to communicate. But words actually have meaning through usage, regardless of what a word originated as or what its root founding is. It means what it means by how we use it in our present context or in any given context like the Bible. So when you want to find out what something really means, you have to sort of look at how it's used, right? Sorry. Technological timeout. Okay. So when we look at the usage of a word across a broad variety of texts, it does two things for us. It gives us a good idea of what the thing means, and more importantly for the students, it gets them a little better at Hebrew. So now I'm going to have several of our students look at, speak about the particular words that they examine. They go like something like this. I'll do the first one. This is the word eretz, and its essential meaning is land or ground. It can also mean a territory, like a region, a specific plot of land. It can mean earth, but it can also mean the depths of the earth or even the netherworld, the stuff underneath the earth. So that's the broad range of that particular word. Now that's, I don't think any of our texts have anything to do with the netherworld. But the particular word in question can actually mean that. That's the reach of its semantic range. Okay, so next up is Shachat. And yeah, Zechariah, come on up. And his name is Zechariah, which is a great Hebrew name. Okay, go ahead.
So the word I decided to look up was shakat, which its primary definition is to be quiet, to be at peace. So that sort of sense of rest, instead of having rest as in you're going to sleep, it's rest as in sort of more of a spiritual rest, as seen in Joshua 11, where it's the land had rest. It was quiet from war. There was no noise of, war chariots being made, of swords being forged. It also has this secondary definition of pacifying, to make things quiet, as shown in Psalms. You give silence, you give tranquility in the places of trouble. Something interesting about this word is, one of the things I had done to look up was I compared the New American Standard to the King James Version, and the New American Standard tends to avoid using rest for this word. It tends to take it more negatively in a form of undisturbed, which I think is interesting because it shows sort of this idea of, again, being quiet, being away from noise, whereas the King James Version tends to use rest a lot more. And so sort of that, how, well, Brian said it earlier, sort of how the usage in our modern language sort of changes it. It also, interestingly enough, shows up as a noun once as shaket, which means tranquility, but in a political sense. Beyond that, though, it's mainly used in prophetic literature to sort of, like in Isaiah and Jeremiah, saying, like, you are the one who makes our enemies quiet. You are the one who brings us rest. And so that's sort of the usage and range of shaket.
Great, thank you, Zechariah. Yeah, this is the most frequently occurring word in all the texts that we saw earlier. It isn't shalom. It's not even the typical word for lying down or sleeping or being at rest, but it's this particular, almost a scientific word. Okay, next is this one, Shabbat. Jen.
So the word that I had was Shabbat. Interestingly enough, Shabbat is not only a verb, but it's also a noun. So in the verb tense, the first definition I found was to cease, stop, or be at a standstill. And the most interesting verse that I found this in was in Genesis 8:22, where God is talking to Noah after the flood, and he promises Noah that he would never bring another flood onto the earth. And he says that the summertime and the winter and the harvest and a bunch of other things will never cease again. Another secondary definition was to be brought to a stop or to disappear. And one verse where this is found is Isaiah 17:3, And in this instance, it says the fortress will disappear. Yes. A third definition I found was to put to an end or to bring a stop to. And one verse that this is used in is Leviticus 26:6. And God is saying that I will remove the beasts of the wickedness. That's pretty interesting. And one last instance where this is used is, one last definition is to be brought to a standstill or to be removed. I only found one verse for this instance, and it was Isaiah 37, but the verse didn't necessarily make too much sense to me. So I'm just gonna use it. So that's the verb form. Now in the noun form, the Shabbat is known as the day of rest or the Sabbath. And my favorite verse which this noun is used is Exodus 28, where Moses is delivering the Ten Commandments, and one of the commandments is remember the Sabbath day, keep it holy. It's like a day of rest. And there's also a word, I believe it is Shabbaton, which is a Sabbath festival, and in Leviticus 25:5, it is known as the year of this Sabbath festival where they take time to rest from all the work.
Maybe did. All right, here.
So my word was nuk. This word it has a couple of different forms, but in one form it means to settle, rest, or remain settled. And it's used during the flood narrative, and it says that the ark came to rest on top of the mountain. So it's in that form it's used to come to a rest. And another form that it has, which is the form in the verse that we're studying, is to provide rest. And this way that it's used in Joshua 1:13 it's used a lot in this in the Bible, and it's used a lot to say like that God will give rest to the land or the people. So in that sense, it's used primarily in a transitive way to say that it's used like with a direct object. But then another interesting part to the first verse is that Noah's name is related to this root word. So it's just kind of like a cool artistic, element to that.
Thank you. Brent.
So I had the word regah, and it, in the hiphil form, which is the causative stem, is to give rest to, or to cause repose, or to live quietly. And the verse I looked at was Jeremiah 50:34, and here it's actually in a poetic instance. So it's interesting to see the word regah used. It is paired up with another word, regaz. So you can see the alliteration being played with that, and also in the previous line right before that, you have the words Rev, Yariv, et Ravim, which also is playing off the alliteration. So this is actually the only instance where regah is used with the land being at rest. So another meaning which is behind it is to be done in a moment. It's the shortest word in Hebrew for a span of time, and the noun that it's related to and thought to come from rageh is where we see this the most. And another interesting thing is that it's usually used in a negative context. So if we look at Deuteronomy 28:65, it has the negative particle no with it, saying that no peace will be given. So, yeah.
Okay, the word I researched is natash, and what sparked our interest was really Exodus 23:11 when we searched for the land had rest. That's one of the phrases that came up. In the 7th year, you shall let it rest and lie fallow. And Natash is the word translated lie fallow there. And as I looked into this word, it's used very infrequently in regards to the land. It's used mostly in a context of a relationship. So we see in Psalm 94, the Lord will not forsake his people, he will not abandon his heritage. We see in 1 Samuel 12:22, for Yahweh will not cast away, that's the word Natash, cast away his people. So usually this word comes across in regards to like someone else, to another person, rather than land.
Great. Thank you, Seth. The lie down in the text that Seth just pointed out is this verb here, shamat. And it means to let fall, drop, leave, or let go, or to remit a loan, to pay something back, or to let it go, to forgive a loan. Exodus 23:11 is the text that Seth just had up. I've retranslated it here because the two verbs are paired very close to one another, and I wonder if it isn't something of an idiomatic phrase, two verbs combining into one idea. In the 7th year, leave it lie fallow. There are two verbs there. You could say let it go and let it lie fallow, or leave it alone, let it lie fallow. Or as Seth just pointed out, the lie fallow this is one of the only times it occurs in an agrarian context. This could be simply two different words for letting something go. Drop it and leave it. So that's the instruction in Exodus 23 for how the Israelites are to treat the land in the 7th year. Drop it and leave it. So, what questions do we have? Oh yeah, let me throw down these other things. So what questions do we have now? Is this mere personification? Once we've collected all this data, we have to sort of think about what this means. If it's an exploratory project like this, we don't have a particular thesis to prove. We're not after any particular agenda. We sort of lay the cards on the table and find out look what we've discovered. Well, my first question is whether we have any consistency around this idea of rest. I mean, what is the rest related to? Is there anything in particular that we are resting or having peace from? Right? The land had rest from war, we saw in one context. We just saw an agricultural context where the land has rest from planting and pruning in Leviticus and Exodus. The land has rest on occasion from wild beasts or from the sword, also in Leviticus. A passage we're going to look at a little bit more in a few minutes. The land has rest from Israel herself, from the people Israel. More commonly in Joshua and in Chronicles, the land has rest from war, conflict. Other forms of conflict, oppression, and rebellion are in Judges 3 and 5 and Judges 8. I have rebellion here because it's unclear in the book of Judges when the land has rest if the land is resting from the conflict that has just taken place or if the land is resting from the rebellion that Israel has wrought. The book of Judges is a series of patterned narratives that follow a particular structure. Israel is faithful, then Israel falls away from God. God brings up someone to punish Israel, and then Israel cries out, and God raises up a deliverer, a judge, some sort of a chieftain, who saves Israel, and then the land has rest. So it's hard to tell if the land is resting from the war or from the rebellion of Israel. And I'll touch on that again in a few moments. And finally, in Jeremiah 50, the land seems to be resting from oppression or having release or peace from oppression. So it's most commonly used in connection with conflict, whether human or otherwise. The land is not necessarily a party in the conflict, but the land is affected by the conflict. And the Sabbath rest is different in that. The Sabbath rest is a break from agricultural use, which is not unnatural, but it clearly costs the land something. And throughout the history of agriculture, people have developed ways to help the land with that cost. Crop rotation is one way that's accomplished. Another way is to leave the land lie fallow. Near our house, there's a field, and it seems like every other fall, somebody, presumably the farmer, dumps a massive pile of white something on the field. I don't know if it's lime or nitrogen or something. And on occasion, it's a big pile of white plus a big pile of black. And then when the spring comes, they spread that stuff all over the field, and then it gets worked into the soil. And they're doing something to help the soil compensate for a loss or be better improved for whatever it is they want to plant. So the land expends something, even though we might think of an agricultural use as a very mild form of land usage, or not even really costing land anything. Not so. And we might think here of the creation text in Genesis, in which repeated connection is made, right, between the earth and work or service of agriculture. And this is really tantalizing if you think about such passages as Genesis 1:11, let the earth green up with grass. This is in the first creation account. It's often translated as burst forth with grass, but it's actually let it grass, or green up, get green with green grass. And we say that, right? Fields green up, or the lawn gets green when it gets healthy, when it grows green stuff. Genesis 2:5, there was no shrub of the field because there was no one to work the soil. Genesis 2:15, Yahweh settled the Adam, the human, in the Garden of Eden to work it, keep it. Very familiar passage for us. Genesis 3, another familiar passage. Cursed is the ground because of you. In toil you will eat of it, and it will sprout for you thorns and thistles. So these are all related to work, not just our work, but also the work that the land does in producing. And the word for tilling the soil is directly, it's the same word as serving or working or even servitude or slavery, being a slave. Now, in Genesis 4:2, in the next chapter, we hear that Cain was a worker of the soil. We might think of him just as a farmer, but the phrase is actually a worker of the soil. Now, it's a different word for work. It's a different word for soil than we have in our text. In Genesis 2, 3, and 4, the word for earth is Adamah. It's not the same as the word for eretz that we had earlier. And this matters a bit, because there's a clear distinction between the two. And the narrative artistry of Genesis 2 and 3 makes abundant use of the pun, Adam, Adamah. Humanity comes out of the stuff that it's made of, right? But it might only matter a little bit, because the word used in Genesis chapter 1, where God says, let the earth green up with grass or sprout forth with grass, is the same as the land in our later texts. So the semantic ranges overlap at least a little bit. Now I told you I wanted to get back to the Leviticus chapter 26 passage, and here it is. The land shall enjoy its Sabbath years as long as it lies desolate, while you are in the land of your enemies. Then the land will rest and enjoy its Sabbath years. As long as it lies desolate, it will have the rest it did not have on your Sabbaths when you were living on it. That last verse, 35, you could actually translate this, as long as it lies desolate, it will have the Sabbaths it did not Sabbath on your Sabbaths when you were living on it. Now, this is a part of a series of consequences that God promises to Israel for their obedience and or disobedience. The obedience consequences are really awesome, and the disobedience consequences are also really awesome in the other way. But what interests me is that the failing of Israel, the religious or moral or ethical failure of Israel, will prevent the land from resting, even if they are following the law, at least in terms of the so-called Sabbaths of the chosen people. So even during a Sabbath year, if Israel is not obedient, ethically, religiously, morally, spiritually, the land is suffering. And when God desolates the land, the passage just before this, God describes what God will do. God says, I will desolate the land, clear you off of it, and then the land will rest. The land will be desolated, but not in the sense that it is damaged. It'll be wiped clean. And then, once those people are off, I can really rest. So that leads me to another set of related texts that has to do with the land, the capability of the land to be polluted or defiled by the behavior of those on it. Not so much damaged in the sense of through war. I think of Europe in World War I, the devastation of the land. But in the sense of a moral degradation of the land because of something that has happened on it. This is Numbers chapter 35, verses 30, 33, and 34. You shall not pollute the land in which you live, for blood pollutes the land. This has to do with the law of revenge and bloodletting. It's kind of complicated. But in this context, all we need to know about is that blood pollutes the land, and no expiation can be made for the land. For the blood that is shed on it, except by the blood of the one who shed it. You shall not defile the land in which you live, in which I also dwell. For I, Yahweh, dwell among the Israelites. And perhaps this, no matter what other conclusions we might draw, this is the key thing here, is that Yahweh is directly connected to the land. Yahweh dwells in the land. The land is something Yahweh gives to Israel. It is perhaps her greatest gift from God, repeated in promise form to the patriarchs, given to the nation of Israel after the Exodus, taken back from her after she disobeys, and then given back after the exile punishment, and then spiritualized in the New Testament as we look forward to a land that is not yet, but already is sort of spiritually present. So the land is directly related to the entire relationship that God has with the chosen people, all throughout the biblical text. But it's not just a present, it's not just a gift, it's not just a great thing to use. It's actually the place wherein God resides. It is the vulnerable recipient of the actions that take place on top of it. And so whether we're talking about war or ethical, religious, moral behavior, or simply what we might consider normal agricultural use, the land matters. Personification or not, it actually is of significance in the relationship between humanity and God. Now, before we take some questions and brainstorm a little bit, special thanks to the students, some of whom presented, some of whom are here, all of whom participated in the production of the thing. Jennifer, Brandon, Zechariah, Aaron, Seth, Dan, Michelle, Jacob, and Sydney. And those are the Hebrew names that we've given to them throughout the semester. I'll point out a few here. Jennifer wanted to be Orpah. Orpah is the Ruth's sister-in-law, right? The daughter-in-law of Naomi that didn't come back with her. Brandon we call Ezra. Zechariah we call Zechariah. Or the actual Hebrew pronunciation is Zechariahu, which is a lot more fun to say. It is. Aaron wanted to be Shlomo, which is Solomon's name, but that's a masculine name. So the feminine form of that is Shlomit. So Aaron is Shlomit. Seth is Seth. You have to be careful with this because it's actually a sh sound at the beginning and a t at the end. So we're sort of like shape. We have to do that. Shape. Daniel is Daniel, except that I've gone with the Ugaritic form of this, which is Dan-el. The name Daniel is often described as God is my judge, but it's an older name than the Hebrew language. It's actually a Northwest Semitic language. In Ugarit, there was a mythic hero named Dan-el, which is mighty man of God. So we call him mighty man of God. Michelle Curtis, Michal, David's wife. Jacob is Jacob, Yaakov, and Sydney really couldn't land on a name. I finally just started calling her Bat Ivri, which is daughter of Hebrew. Which is better than Bathsheba, which is Bathsheba's name, which means daughter of seven.